We'd love for you to learn more about what we are doing here by looking at our website and joining us for a tour so that we can continue strengthening Hawaii's local economy through agriculture.
Okay. Aloha mai kako, everyone. Thank you for joining our session this morning. This is a monthly session that the Waihua Value Added Product Development Center puts on. We call it Value Added 101. Each month we feature a different expert speaker. My name is Naomi Blue Summers. I'm the operations coordinator for the Waihua Product Development Center. I'm joining the room today with Shawn Fels. He is the owner of Agile Food LLC, and I will turn it over to Shawn to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Naomi. And thank you for having us out here today. I'm really excited to have another forum to engage with the work that you guys are doing here. The community is really exciting and poised for incredible opportunities. And so I'm just thrilled to be engaging as I am. Our company, Agile Food, was founded after about 15 years in the industry, watching the difference between multiple different sizes of food organizations and what that meant for their struggles and opportunities, and what it meant for the difference in how they needed to be operated for success. And so Agile Food was formed really with the intent of helping to bring some of those opportunities that are intrinsic to the large multinational food companies who are producing billions of dollars of food a year, and help to make some of those ideals and cost sharing possible with smaller producers. So the intent of our organization is to bring together experts and share them amongst small producers so that we can all have access to the people with exceptional knowledge in the regulatory and equipment world without having to be able to afford a full-time person who's an expert in that field. Today, I have the opportunity to talk to everybody about planning for growth in your small food company. And so I prepared a brief presentation. And during this presentation, I'm going to talk at you a lot, just for a few minutes though. I promise. And part of the intent here is to cover some of the definitions and background that sparks questions for meaningful discussion in the second half of this presentation. So I'm hoping that the presentation part is about 20 minutes. Please hold those questions that we're sparking until I get through some of these slides, and then we'll do about an hour of Q&A and dive into some of the specific questions that are of interest to the attendees here. So, to start it off, sorry, just a moment. I can't seem to get my presentation to advance. It won't advance for some reason.
Want to try opening it up over here?
I can click through as well.
Okay.
So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So we're covering what do you consider when you're trying to grow or optimize a food business today. And to start with, we need to think about the foundations. What is important to grow a food company? So one of the main things is operational strategy. There's a ton of different opportunities. You can work on your own and grow organically. You can go out to a co-manufacturer. You can build, you can buy equipment and set that at a co-manufacturer. There's a million different ways that we can step into increased production capacity. And the facility here is a great example of one of those ways where accessibility to high value and more novel and capable processing equipment can really help to increase value of those products. But that can't be considered in a vacuum. Each of these models have different benefits and opportunities, but also different risks. So as we think about what is the model for our business, this is a spider web of ideology that can take a very, very long time and be very complex to wrap our minds around to make good business decisions. Growth, though, is a decision in and of itself. It's not the only opportunity that we have for these businesses to be successful. There's also opportunities to optimize margin, to saturate or work on distributing more products at higher margin, and to keep your same size capacity or production volumes and increase value through those by receiving higher margins per item sold. So the crux of this is really what is important for my life. How do I want my life to look as a business owner? And what is that philosophy that's guiding the decisions that I make and the roles that I want to play within my own business? This is very much imperative to make good decisions for optimization and growth of your business. If you don't know what your goal is at the end, it can be very easy to evaluate only part of the financial consequences of investments, whether that be CapEx or training that you're choosing for your organization. Defining growth goals is incredibly helpful in determining what types of automation, capital expense, and investments you're going to look for the next stage of growth in your business. If you know you want to be involved in the manufacturing of every one of those products because what makes you tick is being at that kettle or grill and doing that work, then your model needs to be different than if you want to manage people. And this also goes further into types of financing. If you want to plan for the largest dollar amount exit, that path looks incredibly different than if you're planning to grow your business organically. And on top of all of these aspects of where you're driving your business, you layer the ethics and community and the other important aspects of what you're driving with these ethical important products. All of these must be considered before you start thinking about capital expense, build outs, improvements, because until we know what that path looks like, we can't possibly make a good financial decision. And this can have pitfalls across the board. You can have pitfalls here that will appear to be the biggest opportunity your business has ever seen. A potential contract with Kroger, a potential contract with Costco, or New Seasons or Whole Foods. But if we don't know where we're headed, it's easy to try and go after all of that opportunity and find yourself in a position where there's just not enough resources to continue until you reach business profitability on that path. And once you find a path, you have to absolutely unapologetically commit to it. There is no, it didn't work. There is no stop on our path until you succeed in that next stage. And in entrepreneurial business, this can take 50 or 100 pitches. This can take 1,000 food shows. But once you commit to it, stick to that path, and you can drive those outcomes, even through the adversity and difficulty of gaining traction in new sales channels or whatever that might be. So now we have a path. We know where we want to go. How do we decide if it's a good idea to take the next step, whether that next step be built out of a facility or built out of a single machine or training for our operators in various ways? And what I like to do in this situation is to model financially the operations of the business. And I found a model that effectively describes small business growth in food and can help to identify pitfalls. And it uses incredibly common available calculations put together in a way that gives you a good idea of how much each of your sales channels generates in terms of profitability. So as we add up the cost for each sales channel and compare that to the value we receive through each sales channel, we're able to then assign a value to that sales channel. We're going to consider our labor. And when I talk about labor today, I'm going to be talking about all employee payments, but also all related labor costs. Those are things like insurance and taxes that are due by the company. We need to consider if our current cost model for our ingredients is going to be the cost model when we transition into a larger manufacturing volume, because many times we get discounts. We need to think about all of the costs that go into manufacturing our product, and this includes everything not customer related in our discussion today. So if you can allocate it to cost, direct cost. We want to basically add up all our overhead, our utilities, our employees, our materials, our ingredients, all of the things we can possibly allocate to an item. We want to allocate it. And then we take that number and we compare it to the amount that we're being paid through each of our sales channels. Once we do this, we're able to generate a dollar amount profit per unit per sales channel. And this is really the crux. This is the magic number that we're looking for, because this tells us what we're doing today, which customers, which sales channels have value to our organization and which have less value in terms of dollars. And of course, we have to consider branding, marketing value, community engagement. All of those things are imperative, but none of them matter if you're losing money. And so this has to come first, and understanding where you can generate value within those sales channels that we currently have access to. And once we have that number, we can then go in and start estimating saturation. How much of this sales channel have we captured? How much opportunity does our business have on this channel? And in many cases, this is the starting point then for the additional calculations needed to determine if a project is a good deal or not. Because we then have to integrate knowledge we have about what is our forecast for this new sales channel. What is the change in cost of goods? What is the change in labor per unit? And once we add all those things together, we can compare that investment in capital expense to the other paths that we have access to. And when I have run a model similar to this in the past, it came incredibly clear, incredibly quickly, that there were some major risks that I needed to avoid in small business. So as an example, I pulled some of the information from a model I created in this way for Portland Creamery. I looked at these different sales channels: direct to customer, food service, retail, distribution, and direct delivery. And I looked at how much each of them were marking up our product. Some of these are logistical. And so these were then potentially added or stacked to create sales channel costs. And now I have a good idea of what it really costs me to go to the consumer through different sales channels. Here's an example of each of those channels as they were defined for this model. And what I found was, when I ran a financial analysis of what this would look like, I ran it at 30,000 pounds a year, and I ran it at 100,000 pounds a year. So this is about $2 million for the 30,000 pound one. And so 6 to 7 million for the 100,000 pound. And what you see is drastic differences. But I want you to also notice that very top line says solo. And there's some irony here that small represents how Portland Creamery was at the time operating, and that profit per week was less than what I would have achieved running a sole proprietorship and just selling through my highest margin channels. I went further and graphed these, and here on the left, we see extremely high profit per pound and not quite livable profit per year for a sole proprietor. As we grow 10 times as large, all of that growth is absorbed by a reduction in profit per pound. This occurs because I have to enter sales channels to sell those additional pounds that are lower value, but my business is still too small to have reduced my cost of goods. So at this point, my costs are similar at 3,000 pounds and 30,000 pounds. But my sales channels return much less of that as profit when I have to go into the channels to sell 30,000 pounds. And what you find is, as you model this, there's a negative. There is a large swath of this that I could not grow through by taking the money I received from a customer and spending it again, because I'm starting with equipment that is too small. And so my cost per batch is too high, and my cost loss. You cannot run through these new channels at their low margins and make money until you build bigger equipment. But there is frequently a tendency to want to build that equipment and not understand where that break-even point really is, because it's very easy to think I'm operating here at this very high margin per pound because I'm only operating in direct to consumer or markets or these very, very profitable channels, and then use this margin to calculate a trajectory for growth that is linear and increasing. And that's not the reality we see because of the difference in sales channels, margin, and saturation. So here you see the drop and then eventually increase in profit per pound as we increase the size and the efficiency of the capital equipment for manufacturing. So how do we use this information to make good decisions? There are a series of ways that we can integrate this information to maximize profit depending on the model that we want to follow for our company. The first thing we want to do is, of course, track what's happening on these channels. For fastest growth, we're going to have to go after financing because fastest growth means we're building infrastructure that has overhead that can support very rapid growth, which means it's very large. And so one of these models is to integrate an aggressive growth model and go after equity investment or equipment financing. And the plan in this case is to run unprofitably for 3 to 5 years. And most of the time, this is the strategy used for a 7 to 10 year exit goal, because you're trying to maximize value at the time point of 7 to 10 years from today. That's not the only option with this data, though. We can also prioritize self-funded growth. We can say we're not going to play in the channels that lose money. We're going to use those different channel calculations to evaluate trade-offs. Hey, we can put in equipment. It'll quadruple our manufacturing volume. Sometimes it's worth it to go into a channel that on paper loses money. In that situation, 3/4 of your product might lose a penny a pound going into a new production or a sales channel. But the other quarter benefits from the reduction in cost of goods more than the loss on the sales channel you go into. For organic growth optimization, what you want to do is understand how you penetrate and maximize your sales channels that have the highest margin and profit. You can also then use this same model to lay your project plan over the top of. When we start thinking about project plans, now we're going to forecast what do we think our growth and earnings are going to be. And with that growth and earnings, how does that compare to the saturation of sales channels? How does that compare to the cost of regulatory, the cost of quality? All of those complexities of going after the new sales channels need to be added and understood before you know that this is a good path for sustainable growth of the organization. And once we get there, what you're going to find is that oftentimes the projects we think are attractive when we start this process actually are much, much less profitable for the organization than projects that are much simpler to undertake, less expensive, and just the process of creating this model will inform multiple new paths forward that we may never have considered if we didn't understand the opportunity and risk of trying to saturate these various sales channels. All right, that is the end of my talk at you part of today, and I would love any questions as specific or broad as you are interested in.
Everyone, you can feel free to unmute. Or I know we had some folks submit questions via registration too. So if you need a minute to think, then I can ask Shawn some of the questions that folks submitted when they signed up. Okay, so one of the questions that Wayne, who I see is on the call, had asked was, what are the biggest challenges for local food manufacturers scaling up? And Wayne, please feel free to unmute and elaborate if you like.
All right, Wayne, feel free to jump in and interrupt if you are able to get unmuted. So the biggest barriers to scaling a small business are really specific to each small business. I hate giving that response because it's not useful, right? But maybe expanding on it will help. It's really complicated. There are complexities from staffing through finance and logistics and quality and regulatory, and they're always changing and they're always increasing. Supply chain is drastically different between different organizations, and you have to consider growth trajectory on each of those aspects. It's common to saturate a local market in my region. It's common to saturate a local market and still be too small to grow into a Kroger contract. And that's because your margin is so small when you get into true national distribution models. There's a lot of intermediaries and middlemen, and they're in almost every case making more money than the manufacturer is once you get into these larger scale distribution models. Laid over the top of that is increasingly onerous regulations from FSMA, from expectations of third-party certifications such as SQF, BRC, or ISO 22000. We're seeing additional onerous requirements for testing in the regulatory world as well, but also by clients. And another incredibly onerous aspect of growing into a FSMA compliant facility, which would be needed for interstate distribution and commerce, is the drastic cost of a supplier quality assurance program, which depending on your size can even involve going on site to every ingredient manufacturer to do audits, to collect 10 to 40 documents from each supplier every single year to make sure those stay updated. When you start laying all of these costs together, you'll see that CapEx for a few $1 million is very similar to the cost of regulatory of those same products out of that facility. And it is only through understanding your sales channels, how saturated you are, where your opportunities exist, and thinking through all those other incredibly differential and onerous requirements by sales channel that you can really be sure that your financial model would be compelling. And I say compelling because part of financial models, of course, is it enables us to go after grants. It enables us to go after investment, finance, private equity, all of those things. There's an immense amount to consider. However, those considerations are often specific to sales channels, specific to customers, specific to distribution agreements, et cetera. And I think going in eyes wide open and understanding that the margin I get today doesn't even look remotely like the margin I have to play with when I go into true grocery distribution, national distribution, or international distribution. Of course, I haven't addressed anything about international, but that just layers another however many countries you want to go into regulatory bodies on top of your compliance. And these things grow essentially exponentially. I think that is the single largest risk from my perspective of growing artisan companies is the difficulty in understanding what size you really need to build or create or lease or find access to that gives you that profitability that's above the dart of business death, I call it, which is that time when you rob Peter to pay Paul. Basically, you're taking from your highest value sales channels like markets because companies like Walmart charge you fees if you short them one unit. And those things destroy companies very quickly. Never prioritize contract retention over profitability would be one of my pieces of advice in looking at how you grow into these sales channels.
Thank you. So another question submitted via registration from Randy. So Randy asked, what are your approaches to flexible staffing for part-time business owners that do not have a retail space, but only sell via pop-ups and direct-to-consumer channels?
I love this question. I read through a few of these before getting on today, and I was hoping I'd get to speak to this. So flexible staffing, small sole proprietors, you're trying to build brand, you're trying to demo, you're trying to create velocity at your outlets that you've already won, right? Once you get shelf space, there's maintenance that goes into that, and there's additional considerations that have to be front and center. One of my favorite models that I see for very small companies is actually local guilds and or food organizations. I think that the development center here is the perfect hub to consider for the build out of some of these kind of shared resource opportunities. And one of the things I've seen be very successful is shared demo programs. Once you have somebody who has done a demo for your product 10 times, and you've worked side by side with them a few times, they can also demo 3 other artisan products. You're not competing with each other. You're competing with craft. You have tons of opportunity to take sales volume without touching one another's opportunities. And so I would say work together. Find people who will represent multiple companies when they go out and do demos. You'll pay a quarter as much and your products will be in front of people, but also that person will be gaining experience with your brand and your story and your product, and you'll create a network of kind of shared laborers and part-time employees who do it because they're passionate about it. And that's hard to train and that's hard to hire. And so, for example, the Oregon Cheese Guild very successfully ran shared demo programs for 20 to 40 demos a year. They were opt-in from a group of about 13 cheesemakers in the guild, and they almost always had at least 4 participants. Now, if I needed somebody to cover a last-minute market and I have a sick employee or I have double booked myself, I can call that demo person and say, hey, come work a shift for me at the market today, and you pay them for that shift and you're done. I also personally work pretty extensively with Select Temp and various temp agencies because you can sit down and have a discussion with them about expectations for incoming skill set. You can require food handlers permits. You can require that this person has some experience in food service or food, and gain access, even though you're going to pay at least 50% more per hour to this person. If you have flexible labor requirements, that's still a great deal compared to training and other aspects of what would go into this individual. Training is going to be one of your biggest costs to try and mitigate when it comes to flexible workforce. And so as much as you can work together and create a few individuals who have lots of opportunities to engage in the community and be part of the culture, you can sometimes kind of usurp those more extensive training needs and education by finding someone who's already like-minded and part of the community.
Thanks, Shawn. So related to the guidance to share employees, so pivoting or follow-up question. So what type of training would you recommend that local manufacturers require for entry-level employees?
So I mentioned food handlers permit already. I love food handlers permits, not because it's all the information that anybody needs or anything else, except it covers many of the really important aspects of food safety training in multiple formats, in multiple languages, and it's very easy to engage with regardless of who your employees are. And so I always start there. The next set of trainings that I would consider essential for somebody making product that I was selling are those that are defined as GMPs under 21 CFR 117. This used to be, I believe, in 110, 21 CFR 110, and those are good manufacturing practices that should be followed by all food manufacturers. Whether or not you're regulated by FDA, this is a great set of trainings to make a priority for your staff. These include things like hygiene, how are they dressing, employee safety, hand washing, illness, and they really need this information because you want to preclude them coming to work if they're sick, and you want to make sure that they have that information so they're a partner in maintaining your food safety and quality instead of a something to be managed or a risk.
Thank you, Shawn. So in the chat, Christopher asked, can you briefly talk about the services and processing equipment available at the Waihoa Value Added Product Development Center? Are there any near future plans you want to mention? Chime in if you like.
Yeah, Naomi, do you want to give an overview of the offerings or?
Sure. So at the Waihoa Value Added Product Development Center, we basically have 3 buckets of resources we provide. So we've got our physical facility that includes 4 shared commercial kitchens. We have educational programming like the webinar that we're all on right now, as well as if you do decide to utilize the kitchens, we provide training on GMPs that Shawn just mentioned, as well as equipment training specific to the equipment that you wish to use in our facility. Our third resource that we offer is our client services. So we have an in-house product development team that can provide consultation on specific products, as well as perform some analytical food testing such as water activity and pH. Additionally, and somewhat unofficially, we also serve as a connector. So Shawn had mentioned that an approach he's seen for flexible staffing has been having shared employees to do demos, for example. While we do not coordinate that ourselves as Leeward or as the center, we host a lot of opportunities for people to meet and kind of talk organically. And through that, we have seen that some local entrepreneurs have exchanged ideas, resources, recommendations for suppliers. Sometimes even just a bit of moral support is super helpful. So we regularly try to host events both in person and virtually to facilitate those types of connections being made. Shawn has been on site recently to provide equipment training. So some of you folks have met him in person. So Shawn, if you wanted to add in any words about what you saw during those equipment trainings, questions that you think might be relevant for everyone else to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm seeing during the trainings is an incredible engagement of community and a lot of interest in driving ethical, successful, sustainable businesses cooperatively. And I couldn't be more thrilled by that path. The facility here represents one of the most agile and modular R&D facilities that I've ever been in. And I've been in most of the US R&D university facilities at this point. It is really special because it represents an opportunity to evaluate some of these things we've been discussing and to really understand what opportunities you can take advantage of, to have access to generate the product that enables you to test the waters on some of these sales channels and to get the consultation and support to understand the path your organization's on as we've been discussing in this presentation. It really is exciting to see the opportunity in Hawaii's agriculture as well. The diverse, high value product streams seem to have immense opportunity to continue to grow through many sales channels on island and export. And so as we work through, we're seeing great ideas for novel and new products, and we're seeing phenomenal cooperative development where folks are working together to make sure we recover the most nutritive and monetary value from each of our agricultural streams. I think that there's immense opportunity to push the envelope in terms of bioactive or biologic components, as well as in terms of co-product streams, learning how to ensure that we're utilizing each of the streams for the highest value product categories, and really thinking about agriculture as being not just a unit of something that we grow, but an ingredient that has multiple paths to a consumer and multiple value propositions And this facility is set up to help optimize businesses to take advantage of all of those paths.
Thank you. So, Mark from Makaha Mangoes had asked, how do you deal with sourcing issues? So seasonality and or inconsistent supply and quality. I think this question could also go in the direction of sourcing for things like packaging or specific ingredients. Mark, feel free to chime in if you like.
Yeah, I think that's one of our biggest problems is in terms of any kind of scaling is that we have a lot of inconsistency in our sourcing and in terms of quality and quantity, and that continues to plague us. The attempts, we've not been very successful at aggregating material throughout the islands because we're so diverse. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer that, but I think that's the problem that I see so often that we don't seem to make much success on. So anyone want to chime in, go for it.
So, Mark, I'm coming from an industry for most of my career where sourcing was the largest constraint. I operated in dairy for a lot of my career, or biotech, where I was sourcing actual human products, and the complexity and constraints on sourcing is absolutely one of the top necessities to understand for developing that path forward. Inconsistency in supply is addressed in a multitude of ways successfully by different companies. When we look at business models that address supply chain, lean is one of the ones that really emphasizes the need to integrate supply chain into the quality systems of your organization. And when I say that, I'm talking about long-term sourcing contracts, captive supplies. These are games played by all of the very large food producers. When you look at the largest producers, they're not really considering business the way that we think about it. They're not looking at profit per unit today. They're often looking at how do we get long-term contracts, secure long-term supply at the quality we need of our ingredients, and ensure that we don't have competitors by having all of that tied up. When you do that, you have the opportunity to engage in the continuous improvement of your supply chain as well, from a quality and consistency standpoint. But basically, the more power you yield in buying, the more power you have to define the quality characteristics of your supply chain. It's very common to have analytical requirements tied to pay scale changes for large scale supply chain. And that's one of the ways that the farmer is incentivized to get you the products that make the quality that you need for your products to be worth as much as possible. It is essentially splitting that additional value that you get from not having to manage that. That said, you'll never end up with a perfectly consistent supply chain. It doesn't exist. And there will always be ingredient nonconformances or variability that you have to deal with. So the other path is understanding how your ingredient sources vary and building quality tests to first define that variation coming into your facility, and then building manufacturing processes that yield a product that is the quality you want from each of those different types of variations that you see in your incoming supply chain. For example, this might be a test for titratable acidity of the juice, as well as a test for total dissolved solids. If your solids are low, you probably need to supplement with some type of source of sugar to get a consistent flavor profile. And if your titratable acidity is high, you also probably need to supplement to get a consistent flavor profile. So the historical data you have about running your products and your process on variable ingredients is the most valuable asset to start generating that information. The folks making the product, the folks on the plant floor, the ones who really can look at it and know what is different and how they need to modify things, they're the ones to really engage in both learning what to ask for from your supplier and in starting to define consistent operating procedures around those testing methods that you use to measure variability of your incoming ingredients. I'm sorry, it's such a complex and long-winded explanation, but those are the things that I see larger companies doing. Now, as small companies, how do we engage in this? You can find smaller suppliers that are willing to play ball and try for the same types of agreements, long-term, quality-based expectations for total sugar, TDS, bricks, whatever measure you're using. Or you can go and look for partners who are also food manufacturers who need the same ingredients and work cooperatively to act bigger and to go after some of those bigger supply chain opportunities.
Shawn, I would just chime in that something I've also seen in industry is to rely on your suppliers, like ask for a certificate of analysis, a spec sheet, and if it doesn't meet specifications, then don't accept the product. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. I talked about modifying manufacturing, but there are absolutely times you don't want to accept loads of products. There are food safety times, but there's also just food quality times when it's better not to run.
Okay, so I see that Joe has his hand raised. Joe, go ahead and unmute.
Hey, thanks so much, Shawn. I really appreciate this session. 2 questions for you. Number one, I heard you really emphasize profitability and us understanding where our break-even point is. Could you perhaps expand a little bit more upon that?
Absolutely. As we've discussed, there are really successful business models and paths at every size. Growth and exit are not the only path that you have to be on. And so I think consistently across all of the business paths, though, and strategies, consistently maximizing profit is the best option. So that maximization of profit looks really different in each model, but for a sole proprietor, the outcome of this modeling exercise might be, how do I saturate these 3 sales channels and ignore the rest? Because I know if I saturate these, I have my highest margin per product and I sell all the product I can make at my current capacity. And that is an incredibly viable, long-term sustainable model. I actually see more sustainability doing that than in the companies who are trying to organically grow for an exit strategy. The other second most successful business model I see is having lots of money and starting big. That is your second best opportunity to easily guarantee that you're not going to end up unprofitable. The real complexity is neither of those are the most common business plan for any of the artisans I work with. Most artisans are looking at this the way that we've been kind of taught and brought up to grow business, which is you sell product, you make money, you reinvest that money, you get bigger and better, and some of it goes to training and some of it goes to capital, and your company grows because your sales grow. And I will unequivocally say that is not the reality of growing a small food business because of the discrepancy in profit that is returned to the company through the different sales channels. I believe I've watched 20 some small businesses in the dairy industry in Oregon die over the last 21 years. And in many cases, they were the highest valued brands. They were the winners of the biggest contests. They had the most community support. They were incredibly valuable and respected by the community around. They apparently were the successful companies before their failure. And their failure came from trying to grow organically with too small of equipment to achieve a cost of goods that enabled profit through the channels that they were going into. By stepping back and modeling these different channels and profitability earlier, you can choose a sustainable path for your business. And that might not be organic growth. That might be sole proprietorship. If you plan on running for the next 7 years, you're probably much more profitable running for 7 years by saturating your highest value channels. If you're going for a legacy organization, that matters less. And your considerations are, what am I creating, and not necessarily how do I return the most money for the position I'm playing in this business. And so I think regardless of what path you're on, you must consider profit, because it is the one essential aspect of sustainability for every one of those paths. You have to make more money than you spend.
Thank you. So we've got a question in the Q&A. How do you see consumer preferences evolving, and how can manufacturers stay ahead of these trends?
That's a good question. I just predicate this by saying I have not been involved in a lot of consumer testing or evaluation in the last 7 years or so. Before that, I did quite a lot of development with those means with Tillamook cheese. Trends in consumer expectations are meaningful. They're meaningful when you're considering shelf space. They're meaningful to tell your story in a compelling way to get a buyer to bring you into their store. They're meaningful for creating buzz and going viral. They're meaningful in many, many different ways. So sorry, I want to read this question again, so I'm sure I'm staying on the right path. What's that question?
Q&A feature in the Zoom.
Would you read it for me again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that question again is, how do you see consumer preferences evolving, and how can manufacturers stay ahead of these trends?
So unfortunately, at our scale, it is incredibly hard to get consumer data. What you need to have real knowledge in this space is access to one of a couple organizations who really own data related to grocery. And Nielsen is probably my favorite, but you can spend $1 million a year on a subscription to access that data. And so essentially what we have as small scale companies is access to consider the action of the bigger companies. If we have access through universities who have subscriptions or other means to get Nielsen data on your product whenever possible. It is incredibly valuable to be able to look at those, and it helps to tell a really compelling story. If you're going after equity investment, if you're going after a large finance opportunity, you probably have to pay and get some Nielsen data to back that up. In lieu of that, watch the emerging products of the biggest players in food to understand consumer preference. Also, if you're operating at a farmer's market, you have direct access to an immense amount of knowledge of your most important, highest margin customers. And it's easy to ask them questions. In lieu of being able to access grocery point of sale volumes and things and trajectories of the sales channels you want to penetrate, go and look at what's being done. Review products on the shelf. Look for trends and repeats in flavor profiles. Another important aspect to this is considering a product as a functional or a thing of utility. There's a wonderful book on product development titled Jobs to be Done. And the gist of it is when you develop any product, that product plays a role for the client. That role might be delicious treat. That role might be grab and go fast, easy snack, but it's going to play a role in the application of that product. When you're getting into grocery, that role is incredibly important because you need your consumer to connect with it, to recognize it, or they're not going to pick that product up off the shelf. When you are working on penetration in your direct sales and your friends' shops and those types of things, then that role isn't played the same. In those situations, community is driving that sale. Communication with your shop owner who is going to promote and communicate and engage are very important. But as you go into grocery, unfortunately, there's no real substitute for the data that these major groceries are collecting, and it's very hard to get. But what we can do is look at emerging trends of the big manufacturers who have early access to that data, and that can inform a lot of what our understanding of consumer preferences and changes.
So to kind of paraphrase and also add in from my past, it's super important to know your audience. That helps you focus on what to look at and test. And I think also Wayne, to address the part of your question that asks about how can manufacturers stay ahead of these trends. What I've seen in the past is sometimes they'll utilize a co-packer rather than invest in purchasing their own equipment. They'll see if their consumers will like a new product that they're thinking of rolling out. And if it's successful, then it makes sense to invest in their own equipment and take over manufacturing themselves. On a much smaller scale, and shameless plug for the center, it also could look like doing a pilot run using our equipment here, and then just see if it sells at your usual markets. And if it does, then from there you can decide how to progress.
Yeah, Naomi, that's a great point. One of the aspects that's really important when you are looking to start a new sales channel is understanding the merchandising and understanding what your value pitch to the store buyer is going to be. And a pilot run through here enables that research. And I think that is one of the things that really differentiates this site compared to a lot of the other R&D facilities and makes it really optimal for launching products is the ability to do merchandising trials of commercial products.
See that Mark commented that it seems like watching social media is an easy way to be aware of consumer ideas. And yeah, excellent point, Mark. It's just a comment on that. It does seem like it also goes back to who you're trying to reach, because not everyone is on social media, or what you see on your explore page or what have you is really based on what parts of social media you like to frequent. So.
Absolutely. I would caution that it's a great way to get information, but most of them intentionally fail to give us information that is different than the way we already think. So one of the things that really stood out for me during consumer testing in my past is that consumers don't think like me. The ones I was targeting didn't think like me. And it was really important for me to step out of that and design for a different ideal, a different job for that product to do.
So another question that has come up in some of our on-site equipment trainings here is, how do you identify what piece of equipment is the most appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish?
That's a great question. There are, as I'm sure everybody has seen, 100 ways to do most things in food manufacturing. It's not a new industrialization path right now, and so there is a huge range available. Determining what the right path is really has to start with understanding capacity, output, cost of goods, expectations. What do we need to be profitable? So it's kind of you're going front to back and you're going back to front. On one side, you're saying, what are my forecasts? How do I grow this? What do I think I can achieve? And on the other path, you're looking at what's available. What are the bottlenecks if we link machines together in this way or that way? And how does that compare to the forecast that we think we need to manufacture? At that point, once you understand how much you need to make and what your cost of goods needs to be, you can go out and start looking for technologies that enable that. But it's really dependent on the specific functions that your business is performing. Sometimes a piece of equipment saves enough labor to, on the back of a napkin, be a great investment. You buy a $200,000 piece of equipment because it does the job that 4 people are doing and complain about every day, right? And it pays back easily because it costs less to own than what you're paying for those functions. But it is much more likely that when you start to look at equipment, it'll be a lot more complex to determine what's a good investment. It's not uncommon for really large businesses to look at 20 or 30-year returns on the capital expense of building out facilities. And 30 years is a very long time to wait for a return because they're playing a different game at those scales. And you have to play that game of very high volume and low margin to compete with them on their turf. So it's really about finding those paths to great marketing book called Eat the Big Fish. You're looking for the paths to eat the big fish. There's a great thing that we don't have to pay attention to in marketing, which is big companies can't offend large sections of the population by making divisive statements on ethics or quality or food, but small companies can. And one of the ways that small companies can gain market share is by being more absolute in your messaging than a big company can be, since the big company has to appeal to a wider section of the population. So really focusing in on who are my clients and converting 1% to really, really be dedicated to your brand instead of trying to go after everybody, because it's much harder to get somebody really committed to your brand if you have to market like the big players and not offend anybody ever. And so it's weighing those differences. How do we achieve a reasonable rate of return for the size and the status of our business? And does this move us toward the path strategically that we want for whether it be eventual exit or legacy company or sole proprietorship with optimized profit?
That's a great point too, that you don't have to necessarily be everything to everyone. But there is an importance in storytelling and brand identity. So in the chat, Khaleesi asks, does Agile Food have consultants we can hire to help us with modeling profitability and planning for growth? Are there sources of funding that can help us with hiring that kind of help?
Yes, and yes. Look at, I would say for starters, everybody at this scale should be looking at some of the FMPP and LFPP programs that are grant programs offered by USDA. That's Local Food Promotion Program and Farmers Market Promotion Program. These grants are written and intended to be accessed by people like us who need some of that supplemental help to move forward and to plan through the expansion and penetration into new sales channels. Agile absolutely has resources, and this is part of what I do with clients, is help them to think through implications of equipment. I frequently am asked to help source equipment, and I always am trying to take one step back and say, is this really the right equipment for your organization before we move forward? Because it's very easy to kind of get under a spell of the opportunity of automation. And many times the best thing you can do to increase throughput is think about ergonomics. And that isn't equipment, right? And so absolutely, I love going through this process, defining expectations, building that model, building that strategic path forward, and then engaging in a way that's long-term to help folks do those right build-outs at the right time as they move forward.
Joe has his hand raised. Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, thanks so much, Shawn. A question around legacy organizations. Could you talk a little bit about models or paths that legacy organizations can follow around profitability?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you have different options here. You can, of course, be an S Corp, a C Corp, whatever, just basic business, incorporated wherever you want. Let's say Delaware. And that can be run as a legacy organization. You can select your succession plan, you can do it all privately, and you can intend an exit where you're selling to a private party or you're selling to employees. There are other models, though, in businesses that have been shown to be very successful in food when creating legacy. And they're successful because they change or increase opportunity for finance, for cooperative business growth, and for grants. And that would be, should I form a 501c3? Should I form a 501c3 and put half my business in it? Should I look at an ESOP for exit? These types of decisions, the last one I wanted to mention is, should I look at cooperatives? Each of these models, an ESOP, a cooperative, or I guess a public benefit organization as well. Each of those models allows you an exit without going public, right? And of course, you can choose to aim to go public. That's probably our hardest path as an entrepreneur, is to intend on starting a business that will go public, because you have to have an immense valuation first. But in any of those cases, what you garner are differences in your opportunities to take advantage of different finance opportunities like grants, but also the profit that you yield, the regulatory requirements, all of those things can be different. By modeling a legacy organization to incorporate a 501c3, that organization can then reinvest profits without paying tax on them to build infrastructure, as long as that infrastructure isn't otherwise offered by a capital business. And so there are models that should be considered for long-term growth of a legacy business, that if your exit isn't the goal, you don't care about value increase all the time. And what you care about might be infrastructure opportunity or consolidated buying power, or these different things that give you those different opportunities to resolve the risks you identify during these financial considerations. And as you look at different paths forward, it's worth considering the different business models and structures that can enable the rapid growth of infrastructure tax-free.
Thank you. Okay. Folks, we have about 7 minutes left. Feel free to drop in any last questions.
One more question.
Go for it.
Thank you, Shawn. I appreciate that. You're really thorough. I'm just curious. Is there anything maybe you left out of your presentation that you wish you included?
Oh my. For that, I'd have to remember what I've said so far. I think the big takeaway that I would want everybody to leave here with is, think about, if you intend to grow your food business into distribution, really, really consider the costs and the implications and the margin on the channels that you're looking at. Because in my experience, that is the single biggest pitfall to growing and succeeding in food with a small, sustainable business. It really can't be underestimated how onerous some of the channels are compared to others. And you don't have to choose that path. There are very successful paths with just direct-to-consumer sales, through fulfillment, through Amazon, through some of these organizations that would enable growth outside of the conventional grocery model. And the conventional grocery model, increasingly with FSMA, it has become toxic for artisan producers. And this occurred because of the combination. The increase in costs of regulatory was immense, and simultaneously FSMA also transferred some of the liabilities to the buyers at grocery stores when FSMA went through. And what that has led to is a rapid and immense consolidation of brokerages and sourcing, and an immense increase in regulatory requirements and quality programs to access those channels. Increasingly, the minimum viable size to play in those channels has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. We're talking millions a year before you can produce enough to have a cost of goods in many cases that could be profitable in those channels. So my biggest takeaway would be consider if it's really the right path, because it might just look like the path to success when really it's not.
And that's definitely a message that we've heard on some of our previous webinars as well, is to have a clear idea of who your customer is. And so now we're talking about like, are you selling to Costco or are you just selling at a farmer's market? To give a concrete example, Costco recently has a new requirement that product has to go through an X-ray machine. If you're just selling your product at your local farmer's market though, then do you really need an X-ray machine? It's not a requirement. So things like that.
Yeah, so one customer, that's a $200,000 machine probably. Plus they require SQF, plus they require an addendum on SQF written specifically for Costco. When Costco shows up, they ask you to open your books and they pin your margin to a specific amount. When you add this up, you're looking at $500,000 in costs for access. And if you look at your margin on that channel, you have to be so big before that ever pays back that it's a great path if you are growing fast, if you're okay running unprofitably for a few years, if you've got all that cash in the bank. But if you're growing organically, that increase in sales could mean the death of your business, because the margin will be so much lower and the COGS will be so much higher, the direct cost to access that channel. So it's not necessarily that any of these things are good or bad, but they're all totally dependent on your cost of goods, your ability to manufacture, and understanding what those limits are on supply chain, on quality, and channel access, and all of those things.
Thank you so much, Shawn, for sharing your knowledge today. And thank you everybody for joining us. This session has been recorded and will be available on the Leeward Community College YouTube channel. Also, Kelsey's dropped in some information about our upcoming workshop, as well as our Instagram handle into the chat. And a final closing thought from Bill Scott as well. It's important to decide if you're running a business that makes money, and if not, call it what it is, a great hobby. We all have passionate hobbies and love them. So with that, we will wrap up today's session. Thank you, everyone, and have an excellent day.